Cool. We're live. Hey, Janet. Nice to have you here on Sideshow. I want to start right and go right into it. I met you at a conference. Kind of shout out to Experimentation Island from Ton Wessling, um, um, and I was real surprised to find you there. Uh, and your role in strategic finance kind of it blew me out of the water. I mentioned this in the LinkedIn post. It blew me away that like, why are you there? Why are you in this experimentation conference? And I had that feeling because I just honestly never have finance folks around, either in at the conferences that I go to or in a lot of the programs that I'm in. And I want to start out by saying that finance is an interesting area for me personally. I I'm the CEO of Spiro. I run an experimentation program still to this day. I'm a practitioner. I help out one key core client of ours run an experimentation program, and we'll get into the specifics on how finance comes into programs here in a second. But from a CEO perspective, thinking around like P&Ls, thinking around I'm a little bit allergic. I kind of hate finance. Like I hate it. It kills me. It bothers me. I want to press a button and have all my accounting done. I don't want to have all these crazy spreadsheets and conversations and different ways of looking at things. And I really hate it. But over the years, I've realized that accounting is or not accounting, sorry, finance is, there's kind of two sides of it. There's like the backwards looking accounting and like bookkeeping side of finance, and then there's this like forward looking in theory, if you can have the resources to do it, like maybe budgeting and then strategic planning. So your title is strategic finance, and so just start there. Like Janet, what do you like definitionally, what does that word strategic mean to you and to your team? And I'm assuming you're not doing the backwards looking bookkeeping and accounting, but just tell me about that little world in terms of that forward looking side of things, that perspective that I have, and where that term strategy comes in for you.
Yeah. Oh, Ben, it's good to see you again. And I mean, I agree that I was the only person on Experimentation Island with a finance background. So, similarly for me, I don't get the opportunity to be with business folks, experimentation folks, like on the ground in a casual setting very often. I do in my work day to day. I will say that, in my specific role, I work across sales mostly, as well as product when there's opportunities that align with, product creating something that will impact our revenue. Then I go to our sales teams and I talk to them about revenue impact, et cetera. So, okay. So your question on what strategic mean, I think you exactly sort of framed the way that the key distinction between the two types of finance. So there's the accounting side, which is indeed backwards looking. That's making sure that there is no fraud, making sure that your books are submitted in a timely manner, that you're getting out information to your investors, within a month, 2 months of closing your books, and that it's all accurate. So that's the accounting side, which is backwards looking. That is part of finance, but within finance more broadly, and specifically to my role in strategic finance, we are more forward looking. So that's kind of the second piece of it, and what makes it strategic versus just corporate finance or like FP&A. I think you'll hear like financial planning analysis. It's another sort of sub bucket within the finance field. Strategic finance means basically we are, first of all, working as partners to the business. So whether that's product or sales, we aren't just writing down the revenue after it happens and then reporting it. We're having those conversations when decisions are made about where are we investing, and then how do we build towards the overall goals of the business for the future. And so most of my day to day is spent on, therefore, the forward aspect of it, which is having those conversations and then also tying that to the strategic goals of like our executives and where we want the company to be, both in terms of revenue, in terms of, it could be users, it could be our customer lifetime value, like all of those metrics are really key to decision making. And then we're having those conversations up front to create like that strategic vision and to make sure that what we're spending money on aligns with where we're trying to take the company. So yes,
Yeah,
I'll.
big prioritization piece there. It so I want to transition into the strategic finance role with like for experimentation or with it or how do you dovetail with experimentation programs? And I would ask this question from the standpoint of, I mean, I mentioned this in the LinkedIn post that I posted about this episode coming up, that there's a cool article written by Sid Bakru about how the team at Hulu and I since have talked to him and his colleagues at Disney Plus and ESPN and the way that they do experimentation there. They went through a journey a few years ago implementing a center of excellence, and they've got some cool graphics. If anyone watching this, you just Google like Hulu Center of Excellence testing, you'll see Sid's great article there. But there's a graphic in that article where it's like the experimentation pod, right? And you see like designer and experimentation strategist, but you see this is finance. There's like a little ball that says finance there. And so I was excited to ask you this question. I'm like, what does that look like for you? Like that, like what's your perspective there? Like how does strategic finance in the context and framing that you gave there, forward looking, help, directing priority, um, where does it dovetail into an experimentation team? And maybe you would want to redefine experimentation, because I'm thinking from a finance perspective, the bets that can be taken maybe are larger than UI, A/B testing. What might be done in an A/B test? Maybe they are a sales process, for example, or how product hands over potential revenue to a sales team, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's right. So I'd say that yes, experimentation from a finance driven angle, I view it as sort of an investment process, or it's very akin to an investment process. And so when we view experimentation, we're often being asked for money, and we're being asked to trade off between where you want to spend the money. Either you invest in product A or product B, or you test team A or team B in terms of actual roles and see which has more impact long term. So the way that I would view sort of the trade off.
Oh, sorry about
Oh yeah, sorry.
the my producer Martin. I know who he is. He's my producer. He's coming in here though, so he'll jump off here in a second.
All
So
good.
just so you know that. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry
Yeah.
about that.
So experimentation is pretty central to finance teams sort of making that trade-off decision, and then evaluating the results. So when we think about where we want to invest, we want to make sure that we're getting the full scope of like what are the opportunities. So this is where we would talk to product or sales, figure out what are the types of experiments that we want to run, how much will each one cost, and then what are the metrics that we're going to measure success on for each of those, and then making sure that we have a process in place to actually track those afterwards. And I find that's where the challenge is like making sure that the results are being read out after, and that we're tying it in some way to ROI or to revenue or to a very tangible metric that we can all look at and say, okay, this empirically this was a successful experiment or this was not. And so as a result, I like the framing of like how finance is a decision maker within sort of those processes, and we would work sort of lockstep with the product teams, or with the CRO, the chief revenue officer, or our chief marketing officer, and make sure that we're advising them on, okay, you can do this experiment, but here is what we would want the ROI to be like in terms of return on investment. Like what would we expect does it need to be 5 times the cost that we put in place? And maybe this is a full-time employee investment, in which case we would have a pretty clear cost of like, okay, if you add 5 heads, it's going to cost you this much, and I expect these heads to either generate revenue. If it's a sales head, they'll have a certain quota, and then they'll hopefully meet that, and that contributes to our annual revenue goal. Or if it's a product head, these are sort of the product launches on our product roadmap that we want to make sure that we're applying these heads towards. And then let's look at the timing for product launches, and let's make sure that we're putting these resources towards that, and maybe it's going to help us come up with that product a bit faster. And then again, following up on that, you making sure that you are checking that this was successful, and comparing that to the prior state of, what would revenue been without these heads, right? And that's always the tough part, because it's hard to say what would have been if you hadn't made those investments. But that's where pre-planning, working with the finance team and across functionally to align on that ahead of time, and knowing what you're going to want to see from this experiment is really important.
Yeah, dude, that reminds me, shout out to Chris Mercer. He's got this phrase that he stuck in my head around, it should be measurement marketing, not marketing measurement. Anyway, it's just this random phrase, but it's meant to, you have to set up the measurement plan before you market, instead of marketing and then trying to measure afterwards. And you kind of
That's
talked a little
exactly
bit
right.
about that. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. And talk to me a little. I mean, you gave some really good examples: hiring an FTE, product development cycle. Just today, I saw one of my strategists post that he works a lot on Shopify sites, and he's like, if you ever think about, you know, you know, um, adding on a Shopify app to your store, you should ask that app to A/B test it before you do it. So that's another kind of weird, crazy example like that. So I love your examples there too. I imagine that when you're setting up a measurement plan, and this is where you probably sink your teeth in, the experimentation mythos, or the way of thinking, is to try to stand up like the smallest possible example of what could happen. The MVP, if you will. Let's do the smallest loop of learning to know if it warrants a bigger loop, more investment. I don't know if you can say anything about that in terms of how you come in and help the team maybe downsize or reframe the study design, if that makes sense. Is that
Yes.
a good way to look at it for you? Yeah.
Yes, yes, definitely. So, and that's why it's important to involve finance upfront. And I love to be brought into the conversations during the decision making process. I can touch on this later, but there are oftentimes people make decisions in a room without finance, and then it comes to us after. That's a little less ideal, because that prevents us from sort of being able to think about the trade offs, and making the smallest investment possible so that we can save the resources to do as many tests as possible. I think that's the way I would frame it. Because, if you want to spend, say, $1 million on one test, right, that's going to take away from your ability to do multiple other tests that you could have done perhaps for 100,000. And so there's been a couple examples of this. Like, I'd say in my day to day, we often get approached with, hey, we want to test out this new type of product integration with a customer. And we're going to spend XYZ amount at this time. And, but we want to eventually launch this to 20 of our top customers. And so that's going to be, multiplied by 20. It's going to be the cost we expect this will be next year. So when I'm brought in early, which, in these cases I have been, I can say, okay, well, let's think about which customer makes sense for us to launch to, which, maybe we select the biggest customer, or one that's expressed a pain point on this issue. And then we create a plan. And then this is where we can help coordinate the cross-functional discussions between the product team that may be integrating this, and then the sales teams that ultimately have to communicate with the client and then sell it and see if it drives results in terms of the customer being willing to spend more on our platform. And then they'll basically sort of look at, we'll come up with a plan of like, how much revenue are we going to expect from this, versus if we don't invest in this. And then let's do a review of this a quarter later, once this is fully integrated, and we just make sure that we're getting the results that we want. And then we can make the decision of, okay, now we're going to 20x this program, and we're going to, have something to point to that makes it a very clear goal decision for our executive team, in terms of pointing to why this is a good use of funds.
Mm. The way that you're describing that process, I would label as sort of a growth experimentation way of working, an operating system, and the way of, like, bet taking and understanding the trade-offs and setting up the study design and having a hypothesis, and getting the right players in the team to be that kind of way of working. Do you, in your experience, I mean, what labels are you giving that? Is that just the way that you're working with that team? And I put this in the context of, there are certain organizations that might be running a product operating model. Some of these organizations, maybe like some of the tech first organizations over in the US, like Netflix and Meta, et cetera, maybe some of, the more advanced experimentation cultures over in Europe, like Booking.com, for example, and they don't know the legacy ways of working where you're just like kicking things over a Jira wall and you're not kind of doing and they wouldn't call things experiments like you're describing them. What's your experience? I mean, are people calling these things experiments? Are you defining them as such and line iteming them as such in kind of portfolio, you know, kind of management style of like bets and investments?
Yes, that's
Is
right.
that the language that your team is using and that you have experience with?
Yes, we use, I'd say, bets and investments is essentially the language we use, and they are experiments, right? And
Yep.
so yes, that's exactly how we frame it, and and I think that gives the lens of like, okay, this is, especially if it's a bet, it's something that we maybe haven't ever tried before, and we're going to, maybe we have no idea what success even looks like. Which is, a common risk if you're thinking about like a product bet or a, completely new type of spin that you're putting into the business to try to generate something, whether it's revenue, users, more customers, etc. And then you just want to make sure that you are willing to take that risk, and again that you have some empirical measure for what success will look like. And that's what is important for a bet. And then for investments, I'd say investments, like the way we use it vernacularly, is just when it's a bit more of a long term angle and when we're pretty confident that this is going to pay off. Like I think that's how I would say is the distinction. Like a bet is something that maybe is completely new grounds. We don't really know what success looks like. It's a lot more ambiguity. And we're kind of willing to, like, maybe this doesn't work out. Maybe we just spend the money and, it's not necessarily going to have a direct return. But let's see what happens. And the investment is more, okay, they say we have an established team. We want to make this investment of like adding 5 people to that team. So like, how do we, that's a direct investment in the business.
Mm. Most experimentation, even large ones at pretty big orgs, see experimentation as a bit of, especially the traditional form of experimentation, web, digital experience optimization, if you will, conversion rate optimization, a lot of UI, UX work. They see it as more of a cost center than an engine or sort of an
Mhm.
operating system, if you will. And the way that you're describing it is more of that operating system.
Yes.
I'm curious on how, you mentioned the bets and investment language, and we also talked about prioritization. I'm shifting this question down into like this area of around like goal alignment. How are you, from a leadership perspective, aligning those bets and prioritizing those bets with where the organization is going? And you don't have to please don't get into any specifics of your org, but more the mechanics of making sure that, okay, we have a portfolio of bets that we're considering. We have a lot of different teams and stakeholders. How are you cascading, via OKRs and or your own vernacular? You mentioned the bets and investments. Talk to me a little bit about how you're assuring that the experiments are aligning with the broader business goals.
Yes.
And I would also bring in the customer here too, right? Because there's the business goals and then there's the customer, and then the overlap is sort of where we work. We have to kind of know where the market opportunities are, but then be solving the customer problems in context of those of where we think the market opportunity is. So how are you ensuring, or what systems, or give me some new vernacular maybe on like how you're making sure that everything is aligning across the orgs and teams?
Hmm. This is always I'd say the big challenge most organizations face, whether you're big or small. Like I've seen that kind of across companies I've worked for. I think a successful process begins top down, and making sure that what your executive team's vision is for the organization aligns with your customers, right? And so it's got to have, you have to be on the same page. That doesn't always happen. I think there are times when people internally want to make decisions not in the customer's interest, but because maybe it's their own personal interest, maybe it's just something they think is good but may not align with the customers. And so that's where it's really important first to understand what your customer's vision is and making sure that your leadership team also is on the same page and is communicating that down through the organizations. And when it comes to experimentation, it's often cross-functional, I'd say, especially when we're talking about larger investments and larger experiments. It's going to require not just one team saying, oh, let's go and let's do this because we think it's a good idea. It's got to reach full alignment typically for it to be successful and for it to have long-term scale, because you can't go forward and then one team has a disagreement with how your approach is or what you're doing. And the way to do that is, just clear communication, having a good process as well in terms of, okay, here are the stages of review. We're going to start with this is, someone's going to communicate the goal. Then we're going to communicate that across like these 5 teams that are going to have to get involved and going to have to state their perspective and what they need to make this happen. Then, you can go into sort of the financial modeling stage, which is the point in which, I'd say finance is more involved. Like if it's a something that can be modeled, and doesn't have to be financially impactful. It could be also a market share model. It could be a expansion model of like countries. It can be anything, and that's where finance can typically help at least lend a POV on, just through our experience, and say, okay, I think based on these growth inputs from these other teams, we're going to estimate this as the expected outcome. And then you make your ROI goals and sort of your more directly measurable goals clear, and you communicate that across, and then you go ahead with the decision whether it's yes or no. I think it's also important to be able to say no. I think that's actually a piece that I think a lot of organizations struggle with, is they find it very difficult to say no, especially if the request is coming from the top, right? If it's especially a smaller organization, like your CEO is telling you to do something, oftentimes you're going to just do that, even if you have disagreement with that. And I think there needs to be a good process for stating disagreement across the organization, and sort of stipulating like the concerns before those decisions are made. And often, it may not, I've seen that as a big challenge, like just across, and the bigger the organization, honestly, the harder this becomes, because you have to communicate with so many parties, and there's many levels of, okay, is this person just disagreeing because it's not in their org's interest? This might hurt their org structure in the long term if this succeeds. Things like that. You have to really take into account like the politics, for lack of better word, of how decisions get made and how organizations are structured, and then try to minimize that as much as possible, so it's not interfering with the empirical analysis of like, is this going to be good or bad for our long-term goals?
Yeah, I think I want to double click into this a little bit, because I think that there could be, or I want to ask you about different mechanisms or artifacts to actually handle that sort of bottom up approach to decision making, because you started out there saying, and which I agree with, that success starts with top down alignment on, this is the way that we're approaching the market, and these are the problems that we're going to be solving. But then there's got to be that handoff where product managers or whoever's on the front line with customers then use a tool of bet taking and experimentation and talking with customers, use these tools to solve those problems. And so I think you hit upon it perfectly. Like there's got to be some governance and standards to be able to facilitate that and kind of scale that solution and say no, like to say like we're going to prioritize this over that, or this is how we're making a decision, basically. And so I think one of the leadership's jobs is actually to provide tools to whoever they're leading to be able to make decisions on their own, and relevant and quick decisions. The faster decisions, the better. So let's ship further. So I'm thinking around financial models, actually, and I'm thinking finance actually plays a key role. If there's even a back of the napkin finance model for, if we run experiments here and we get this type of lift, this is the type of gain we would expect. And that model then can be used to align everyone to the same page.
Yes.
And so when they get that request and they say like, hey, well, let's do this thing over here, and be like, well, we could, but it's only going to be worth this amount of money. And I've got all this stuff in the backlog that's worth more money. So the, goal tree maps, finance models, Even statistical power analyses could, across like a digital experience, times audiences and all of that could come into play to create some nice finance model that teams can use as a tool without you in the room, right? Like in theory, like I'm wondering about your perspective here around artifacts that are financial artifacts that can help with governance.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, what you're explaining is essentially data-driven decision making, and I I think that's core to good decisions. Is you need to ground yourself in the data, like, and then maybe you don't have perfect information, but you can do as much market research and as much sort of internal modeling and impact analysis as you can, with the resources you have before you enter into especially a really massive decision. You want to make sure also that people are open to discussing the data. So I think there's an element of like having an organization and sort of a culture that values looking at the numbers, and even if they don't tell the story that someone wants, being open to the feedback of like, okay, this, maybe I don't disagree with how this analysis was done, but like I can understand its risk, like the risk that's flagging. And then having a team, whether that's finance or another team, that's able to do that in a very objective manner. So you often don't want the business owner that's making the investment to be running the model, or to, be putting together the analysis, because you will find potentially biases in the way that things are done. And that's where, again, I think that is the core function actually of finance, like in my view and in my experience, is like to be the objective third party often, because we're not on product side, we're not on sales side. We are, a good functioning finance team is aligned to the executive team's vision. We want to do, we want to improve our financial results, whether it's profitability or revenue, et cetera. And we want to make sure that every decision we make and every outlay of cash that we give is going to support that. And we want to also be empowered to flag when we don't see that. And I think a lot of times, people see finance as a blocker. I think that's usually especially in the cultural shift that has to happen between like smaller orgs and larger orgs, just speaking generally. I think early on it can be seen as, oh, okay, we're only going to bring in someone in finance because we need to close the books, and like, but don't let this person get in the way of like the big ideas, or like, they might just say no because they just want to save a dollar and they don't really care about like the long term of the company. I think that's that's kind of a tricky, I'd say, balance, but also like making sure that first that you have the right finance team in place, but then also like I think that is why you want finance though long term, is because like, yes, maybe initially there's some balance of like when we say no, when we say yes, but then long term there's an objectiveness and there's a vision, if you have the right leaders in that organization, to do what's right for the company. And that's what you should use as like a tool for growing the organization in a smart and sustainable way, because you can't grow forever at unlimited cost. So that's the how I see our review. And it doesn't have to be just finance playing that role, but you need some team. It could be operations, right? It could be product management, right? Like making sure that there's someone on your team when you make these core decisions that can create like a empirical view of like the situation.
Yeah, I think it's finance is oftentimes it's data
Mhm.
that tries to do this. Um, I see there are oftentimes problems there because, especially in terms of I might say like infrastructure data ecosystem that requires its own budgets and its own there's a lot of overhead there, and maybe less so on finance, to be maybe a little bit more objective on
Yeah, that's
what
a
what
really good point.
tooling gets prioritized and things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, the data team. No, that's actually a great example. 'Cause, that's right. They could play that role too. But like, yeah, per your point, like finance could be like you could have fewer folks, and it could be a more cost effective way to sort of have that function separate from like the data team. Also, the data team could be embedded in certain decisions, like they often, maybe they have their own incentives on what software we invest in or support as a company because of their own goals like of that team. And I think that's, anyways, but they can definitely play that role as well.
So another question, staying on this topic of reporting and measurement, just getting a little bit more tactical. I imagine that the finance team would have opinions on some of the vernacular on to standardize some of the vernacular around the measurement plan, the study design, and so things like metric definitions, for example, of course, but also even nomenclature around what is a win, is it, and what from a program level are you, what does success mean? Is it win rate? Is it velocity? Is it like, what is a win? Again, going back to that one. Do you have any, there's a really cool example that Jordan Lentz gave at the GMS conference about a month ago in Frankfurt, where he showed for booking.com, the experimentation program, where they were optimizing, for on-page sort of conversion metrics and revenue for a long time. And he showed the screenshot of like the product page and where all the hotel metadata was. And it was like a casino. It was like a circus going on. It was crazy. And then he said, well, we fixed our metric to account for more, not exactly LTV, but to account for more of a lagging indicators of success. And he showed a much cleaner interface. And what the experimentation team started to see was, quite drastically different results when they changed those metrics that they were optimizing for. So maybe talk to me a little bit about the tactical nomenclature of where you see good names or bad and your experience there. I don't know if you can take that where you want to go with it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think yeah, typically when we look at investments, I think our main criteria is is ROI. We want to make sure that we would view a successful investment as hitting a certain ROI threshold. And that's a number you would set internally and specific to a project. So maybe that's 5 times. You expect every salesperson to generate 5 times their cost in revenue. And so that, for example, or, for product launch, like same thing, but maybe now it's spanning a different time horizon. Because I think that's also important because product launches often can take years, whereas a seller in seat could in theory carry a quota immediately from day one. So you want to be very clear about the parameters that you're working with within that metric. I think the other thing, we do look at things like growth, right? Growth, I think, is the most empirical. um, you can look at that across different metrics, where it's revenue or users or customers, and you can define ahead of time where where has your growth been, and then what you expect that to become following this experiment, or in a sort of a baseline state, and you can forecast that out, and then you can compare results to that. And then sort of like say the last third one is just the margin, right? And this is more of a finance view, but I'd say that making sure that overall whatever decisions you're making are contributing to where you want your margin to be, whether you want this to improve your margin profile in a 1 year time frame, or you understand it's going to cost you a couple points on your margin, and that's okay because you're going to get XYZ in return for that. So I'd say those are kind of more the key sort of metrics that we would look at. So
Nice, yeah. Um, Talk to me a little bit about um, maybe a little bit of a circle back, but in terms of your collaboration with these, you mentioned it's cross-functional,
mhm.
experimentation naturally is. Who are you interfacing with most, day to day? And I want to drill into a little bit of maybe not those sales organizations that you typically work with and those types of investments, but more so maybe on the product side where they're doing, where a lot of the listeners and like the people that I work with and the audience that I think that would be listening to this are running, I hate to call it traditional experimentation program, but more like digital experimentation type of work, whether it's like, product design, engineering, kind of classic triad that are tackling sort of like maybe introducing a new product feature or something along those lines. But talk to me about the way that you are interfacing with those types of teams. And again, it might not be sales for you,
Yeah.
but that cross-functional nature of how you're working with them.
Yes, absolutely. So I think when it comes to Because aside from, yeah, putting away sales, I'd say that marketing is probably one of the most important stakeholders that we work with, in terms of just us as sort of a parallel to areas in which we're spending on growth for the business and that have drivable metrics and experiments that they want to run. So marketing is typically going to be the org in which you are doing, for example, paid media investments or um, testing out, like, okay, if we, what was the conversion on, if we spend this amount, we want to get X in return. Like, let's optimize like where we're allocating our marketing dollars to make sure that we're putting it in the best place. So I'd say that's kind of a direct area in which we do a lot of direct experimentation, with funds, and this is true across like all orgs. I will also typically with the product teams, we would get involved if there's also a product manager involved. So we would liaise with that PM, and they would sort of handle the collaboration with the product owner and with the engineering teams that may be driving this, and then helping to bring your cross-functional teams along. And that room usually looks like you have a business stakeholder, whether it's sales, biz dev, etc. You have an engineer who's maybe in charge of a specific build and product. And then you have operations sometimes as well. If there's like an implementation piece and go to market, like you have to have that person in the room. Then you have finance, and then you have your PM or PMM person leading that charge and sort of collaborating and getting everyone together. So those are kind of the key folks that I would work with, or that I've seen finance folks work with. I think obviously depends on the decision making here. I think that there will be opportunities in which finance should go directly to the engineer in charge of the product, and understand directly what the investment ask is or what they want to do. But yes, and then like I said, within the marketing organization, like typically we would work with the folks that are directly leading experimentation and allocating the most dollars, for lack of like a better framework, like whoever is in control of the most money, whether that's the events team, whether that's the paid media team. Those are the folks that we would coordinate with directly day to day, because we want to make sure that that team understands how we're viewing the investment, what the P&L impact is going to be of what they're spending, and then we can sort of problem solve together what does success look like for the amount that you're spending, and like what are the guardrails? When do we know to also stop spending on a particular piece that we've invested in? Like what is like failure like look like, right? And when do we, so that we don't keep putting in more money if something's not working.
Yeah, you hit upon one of my last questions, which was, I think it was my last question. How do you approach budgeting for experimentation? Like you just nailed
Yeah.
it. Because I imagine that, finance, again, I'll circle back to the beginning of the conversation. I never see you guys at this role at the conferences or on the teams that we typically work with, even in very large enterprises with high velocity types of programs. And I think that, I mean, what you're doing is painting a picture that finance needs to take a much bigger role in these teams, and I think that you provide the tools that are needed to bridge. So it's sort of the Rosetta Stone into C-suite, into management, into the company-wide objective kind of language, if you will. But yeah, so that's my set of questions. I typically try to keep these about 40 minutes. We're about there. Um, yeah. Any questions for me? I'll say before I actually, um, there has been a couple times, and I've been creating what I call financial models for experimentation programs for some time now. And there's been a few instances where I point people and say, like, if you feel like your experimentation program is stuck, like, have you aligned with finance? Have you talked with the CRO or CFO? Have you aligned with that finance team? And because having them as an ally it could be incredibly powerful to, I don't want to say move your agenda because that sounds kind of nefarious, but like, make your case, like get on solid footing, be data led, if you will. And in two cases, I mean, I'm, Stuart E. Off at RS Group and Catherine Krim at JC Penney, um, did just that and kind of reported back some great success that they've gotten. Actually, Catherine will be, both of them will be at the conference in October, which you're coming to as well.
Yes.
But I think I want to push this message a lot more, trying to align experimentation, not align it with finance, but really just merge with the perspective of finance. So thank you, Janet, for coming in and asking these questions. And any last questions for me, or anything
Yeah,
that you
I'm
want to get
actually curious
into?
how you work with your finance org, and does what I say like is that close to how you work with them, or like how have you thought about finance within your organization?
Well, so my organization is really small, and it's an agency, and actually, my finance manager is listening to this. She saw my LinkedIn post, and she's like, "Ben, should I listen to this?" And
Nice.
we are trying to do budgeting and more of that strategic. I think that we're going, a small organization going through the growing pains of finally getting that backwards perspective under wraps, and now looking forward towards bet taking and investments and having that lens. And so, circling back to the beginning of that conversation, that's what we're really excited about, working a lot more closely um, to go forward with. But my, I'm very mission driven with the org. My mission with Spiro, and just the way that I work and think, is having experimentation as a superior operating system to grow a business at all levels. And I like to hire practitioners, like experimentation practitioners, at every level. Um, and finance is one where I've never had the excuse to, like, oh, I should go get an experimenter to run my finance. And but it fits. But I've been a part of and consulted with dozens of very large experimentation programs, and almost never has finance been at the not never. There has been a couple of instances, but almost never has finance been at the table. And so that's why I find I'm really excited to have the conversation and get this conversation out there.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I appreciate you inviting me to do that as well. I think, I'm trying to break the stereotype that finance is just backwards looking, number crunchers, accounting, just making sure your numbers tie. We have to do that. That is a core part of, operating as a company, is make sure that stuff is tight and that you have it
yeah,
correct. But at the same time, I think the missed opportunity is that, we aren't just here to play bad cop, to say no, to we're here to really try to be thought partners. And I think that's at successful organizations, I do see that. I see that we are viewed as, okay, let's bring them in the room and let's just have an independent perspective, and let's have them, often they're maybe more they bring an analytical lens that you don't have across some other team members, and they can help you understand better what your end goal should be. And so that's what I really hope that this conversation shows, is that, I think it's important to have a good finance partner, hopefully, on your team. And I think the earlier it starts in an organization, actually, I think the better, because I have also seen that if you grow too big and then you start to try to add, the finance org, or you try to, implement these rules, it tends to take a long time to transition, right? And to have that, I call it financial soul of like an organization. You got to build that from the start, so that, that you're kind of growing in lockstep with your overarching goals.
yeah. There's a lot of organizations that are trying to solve that exact problem by trying to implement the product operating model, but they're not coming at it from finance. They're coming at it from trying to, exactly what you said, but pointing to more around like designers and developers, trying to enroll them instead of just being shippers of tickets, being shapers of experience, and enrolling to the, let's have you come in and be part of the team to shape what we're doing, and have a voice and opinion, etc. So this is the product operating model, like smaller, cross-functional, accountable squads, if you will, that do it. But now this is just like blows my mind around, like, oh shoot, finance, like, and again, not just a gatekeeper, but actually a member to help shape where we're going, and how we should go that route, and what problems we should solve, how we should solve them, etc. So Yeah, awesome, Janet. Look forward to seeing you in person in October at TXL 2025. Janet's one of our moderators there. It's going to be great. Yeah, thanks again.
All right. Thank you so much, Ben. Good talking to you. All right.